slowly kills you over time by restriction of fluid flow. I'll tell you, in my experience, after taking care of people for 30 years, one of the biggest missing components of pelvic floor issues is stagnation of lymphatic flow and venous flow, vein flow. And it stays trapped and congested around the pelvic inlet. And that's what causes the muscles of the pelvic floor to become very, very tight in reaction to that. All right. That's something we'll talk about in a moment, known as the muscle guarding reflex. The person's likely been also stuck in fight or flight for a long period of time. So you will be looking at the sympathetic nervous system in relationship to the pelvic floor. All right. So if we already know that, we're going to be looking at the sympathetic nervous system to the pelvic floor. It's probably a pretty good idea to think about what spinal segments will influence the pelvic floor. So, what spinal segments do you think from the parasympathetic side, that's the healing, recovery, regeneration, relaxation, would be going to the pelvic floor? Most likely it's going to be what? The sacrum. S2, S3, S4, right? That's the parasympathetic that's going to be hitting down towards the pelvic floor, pelvic inlet, all of that. So let me tell you already what's one of the best things you can do to help S2, S3, S4. Put a vibration ball, a vibration on the sacrum. Doing that will really help S2, S3, S4. It's also, by the way, one of the best ways to help somebody poop. S2, S3, S4 with a vibration ball is the magic poop button. That'll help you evacuate out really nicely. All right. What about the sympathetic side? Where do you think the sympathetics would come from? So it's important to remember, where does the sympathetic nervous system live in the spine? What are the levels that they live in? If you remember from some other case studies, I'll show you. This is a little mini skeleton. They will live between thoracic 1, right there, thoracic 1 and what? Lumbar 2. Lumbar 2. Okay. So they end at lumbar 2. So the key area that you want to work for the sympathetics to the pelvic floor is going to be like T10 to lumbar 2, T10 to L2. So this is the first takeaway. I want you to do a lot of stuff to T10 to L2. But it's really, really important to think in your mind what muscle that people use on a regular basis that helps them breathe, that attaches to that area of the spine. The thoracic diaphragm. Okay. Remember, the thoracic diaphragm is a muscle, and it will attach to that region of the spine. So if you have an issue with your thoracic diaphragm, you can therefore have an issue with the spinal segments in those regions, which can therefore now do what? Impact the pelvic floor underneath that feels the symptoms from the diaphragm dysfunction up top, right? And remember, you have the thoracic diaphragm that sits below the lungs and above the organs like a parachute domed muscle, like this, right? And then at the bottom in the pelvic floor, it's called the pelvic diaphragm. That's also muscle because diaphragms control pressure. That's what a diaphragm is. A diaphragm controls pressure. So you have the thoracic diaphragm up top, and then you have the pelvic diaphragm underneath. So they work together, remember? So if you breathe in and you inhale, this thoracic diaphragm contracts, it actually flattens down, and it pushes the organs towards what? The pelvic floor underneath. That should catch it. Then when you exhale, this one relaxes and now redomes, and then the organs come back up, and then the pelvic floor muscles can come up here. What can happen is that, yes, you can have issues down here at the pelvic floor, but if you have issues up top where you're locked in the thoracic diaphragm, that keeps constant pressure down underneath. And that constant pressure and that constant tension can cause hypertonicity, hypertonic muscles, and you get a hypertonic pelvic floor. You can also get a hypotonic. That means there's not enough tone to the muscles. You can have hypertonicity, which is too much tone. Now, you've got different quadrants of the pelvic floor. You've got a front pelvic floor, you got a back pelvic floor. One would prevent you from peeing your pants. One would prevent you from pooping your pants. So when you have to hold off pee, you constrict the pelvic floor and it stops urination. Then you have the one in the back that you squeeze so you don't poop yourself. So though both of those can be hypertonic, or both of those can be hypotonic, or one can be hyper, one can be hypo, vice versa. And you have different quadrants. So when you have the front pelvic floor, you have a left front pelvic floor and a right front pelvic floor. And then you have a left back pelvic floor and a right back pelvic floor here. So you actually have front, back, quadrant, 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 quadrant that need to work with each other. Now, one of the things that happened to me was at a hypertonicity of the anterior pelvic floor, the front pelvic floor. And that constant squeezing for me, hypertonicity, caused the problem with the prostate because that actually constricts urinary flow, right? And what have we said in the past about tight tissue? Tight tissue. Tight tissue does not accept blood flow well. Tight tissue does not accept blood flow well because it's too tight. So when you have decreased blood flow in, you have decreased what? Oxygen going in. And when you have decreased oxygen going in, that's called hypoxia. And the hypoxia will cause inflammation. And then when you have inflammation in those regions, the muscles respond to the inflammation by the muscle guarding reflex. So they'll tighten up even more to protect themselves, but they'll also guard to protect the organ with the inflammation. And you get caught in this vicious cycle. Now, what happens when you have too much tone and tension? You decrease flow in, but you also do what? Decrease flow out. What's the outflow from the pelvic floor? What's the outflow from the pelvic floor? There's only two outflows: veins and lymphatics. All right. So if you can't get fluid out, you won't get fluid in because there's already too much fluid in that can't get out. And the body is not stupid. It won't let you put something in when it can't get it out or when there's already too much something there. So it actually purposely restricts blood flow. It purposely restricts blood flow because you got no outflow. Now stay with me. The sympathetic nervous system does what? The sympathetic nervous system controls neurovascular tone. It controls the tone of the blood vessels around an area, in and out. The sympathetics constrict blood flow. If you don't remember anything from my teachings, just remember that. Constant sympathetic dominant hypervigilance, fight or flight, slowly kills you over time by restriction of fluid flow. That's the biggest way it kills you. Constricted pipes are smaller pipes. Constricted pipes have more resistance to them because they're smaller. And the higher the resistance, the less the flow. I'm going to say that again. The higher the resistance, the less the flow. So one of the ways that you can help the pelvic floor is to begin to work on those spinal segments from T10 to L2 by working directly in that region, but also beginning to work on what? Your breathing pattern, your diaphragmatic breathing pattern, and or release the tension in the thoracic diaphragm, which we'll go over. So there's a lot of stuff that I want you to think about here beyond doing Kegels.